Welcome to Epi in a Minute. In this video, we're going to be looking at the different study designs used in epidemiology and comparing them one against the other. Epidemiology is the scientific discipline that investigates the causes of health outcomes in human populations. Controlled epidemiological studies look at and measure associations between an exposure, such as tobacco smoke, and a health outcome, such as lung cancer. We can use controlled epidemiological studies to identify risk factors for disease, to provide the logic behind an intervention to improve health and prevent disease, and to provide the foundation for determining the causes of diseases in humans. Figuring out whether an exposure causes a health outcome requires controlled studies reporting a statistically significant association between the exposure and the outcome being studied. Every study question is just a variation of the question, what happens to the thing I'm studying if it's exposed to this or that? In the real world, exposure and outcome do not exist in a vacuum. Surrounding the exposure and outcome are all sorts of other factors that complicate the relationship between exposure and outcome. Before we can confidently state that X causes Y, we have to think about what else could cause Y. Could it be pure chance? There are 5 basic study designs in epidemiology used to determine if there are statistical association between an exposure and an outcome. These 5 are case reports, cross-sectional studies, case control studies, cohort studies, and controlled trials, the 5 C's. But which design is right for your study? The first major decision to make is whether you'll be doing an experimental or an observational study. Only an experimental study can prove that X exposure causes Y outcome. That's because in an experimental study, you, the experimenter, control everything. The chance causing the variables and the type and level of exposure, and the type of health outcomes. Only one of our 5 C's is an experimental study, controlled trials. We'll talk more about the benefits and downsides to conducting a controlled trial in detail in a later video. So if experimental studies are so great at establishing causality and proving that one thing causes another, why aren't all studies experimental? Well, controlled experiments aren't always possible or ethical, especially when you're studying humans and disease. Would you join a study where you were required to smoke cigarettes? Most of the time, observational studies are needed to discover how certain exposures are related to various outcomes. The remaining of our 5 C's are observational study designs, uncontrolled case reports, cross-sectional studies, case control studies, and cohort studies. Each of these study designs has a different purpose, and each has its own pros and cons. Case studies are an observational study design with no real analysis. They are uncontrolled, anecdotal reports that describe the experience of individual patients or groups of patients. They're great to generate future research questions, but they only describe and can't establish cause and effect relationships. Cross-sectional studies are like taking a snapshot of the exposure-outcome relationship and all the surrounding covariates. You can describe what his exposure-outcome relationship looks like in your snapshot, but you're pretty limited in making any other conclusions. Case control studies are controlled studies that compare people with a disease, the cases, to those without the disease, controls, with regard to their history of exposure. Case control studies look back through time at potential exposures that both cases and controls may have encountered. Cohort studies are controlled studies that follow a group of people over a period of time. People exposed to a risk factor are compared to people who are unexposed, and then you wait to see if exposed people have a higher rate of disease. In this video series, we'll look at each study design in detail and go over when and how to use each of our 5 C's. We'll also look at covariates and how they influence outcomes. And we'll be sure to consider potential biases that can influence the results of your study. So join us, won't you, in discovering the essential elements of study design.